speakers. We are also pleased to welcome the participation of the South African Young Academy of Science and the Mauritius Young Academy of Science Initiative. Through the Young Academies, we are aiming to reach out to female early career researchers to participate in the project. We are privileged, of course, to be joined by experts who bring a wealth of experience and in science advice. So MAST is deeply grateful for the collaboration with the Academy of Science of South Africa and the Global Young Academy Science Advice Working Group, our partners in the project. So now I'll just give a brief outline, a brief overview of MAST. We have been established since 2007. We are a small but yet dynamic academy with 39 dedicated members. As a non-profit, non-governmental organization, our mission is to engage in critical discussions on scientific, technological, and innovation-related issues, including the social sciences. We operate as an independent think tank, providing valuable advice, we hope, to the government, private sector, and the public. Our overarching vision is to foster a society that harmonizes with nature through the appropriate application of science and technology. So there you are. Thank you very much. After this introduction, I have the pleasure of giving the floor to a distinguished personality with immense experience, Professor Olubukola Babalola, a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa and a Vice President of the Third World Academy of Science. So the floor is yours, Professor Babalola.
So much for that introduction. Dear stakeholders, I bring you greetings from the Secretariat of SWAZ Region Africa and OWSA Africa. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all. The Mauritius Academy of Science and Technology MAST has the foresight to see that for its expertise to remain relevant, there is a need for shared ownership of agricultural problems and their solutions. And the MAST is set to accelerate its scientific concepts by providing training opportunities for policymakers that will ensure that policies are grounded in sound scientific evidence. Offering scientific advice on food security to policymakers is a pillar in the strategic co-development of sustainable solutions. And that is very crucial to effectively addressing SDG 2, Zero Hunger. This approach will foster a more inclusive and collaborative environment. And the representatives now, which we have, the stakeholders from the science background, from policy making, from agriculture, and even from the societal background, we come together to provide balanced input on projects and policies. This is a capacity building opportunity for policymakers, and that will help to better understand scientific principles and their application to policy and agricultural practices. I want to applaud the initiative of the Academy of Science of South Africa, ASSAf, and the Global Young Academy Science Advice Group GYA in the willingness to guide policy development and ensure that sustainability is at the forefront of all food security policy consideration. I joined MAST and the Mauritius Young Academy Initiative to thank the network of African Science Academies InterAcademy Partnership for the capacity building grants. Welcome again, and let us embark on this journey with determination and hope. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Babalula, for your very inspiring and invigorating address. And we are really thankful to have listened to you. We do hope that you will be able to join us on our future meetings as well. I know you're a very busy person, but you're most welcome to join us.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would like now to invite Dr. Justine Germu to deliver her address on behalf of Global Academy Science Advice Working Group. Justine has been a member of GYA since 2020, and she is an executive member for 2024-2025. So the floor is yours, Dr. Germ. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Justine Germu from Cameroon. I am the Deputy Director of Research, Innovation and Valorization at the Institute of Medical Research and Medicinal Plant Studies. So I'm also the president of the Cameroon Academy of Young Scientists, and I'm here under the umbrella of the Global Young Academy. So the Global Young Academy is a network of about 200 members with more than 450 alumni. They are represented in 100 countries in the 6 different continents. So the vision is to give the voice to young scientists around the world. What we do is to support young scientists in their career development, in their independence, is to build capacity in developing words, is to engage in dialogue on scientific issue among discipline, nations, generation, and to promote also the integration of science education and science policy. So how we do it? We do it by developing a global network of young leaders in science. We comment via position paper, statement, op-ed, and other articles. We give the advice and input on international institutions and fora. And we conduct also research study. We also support Young Academy, National Young Academy. So the Global Young Academy has 4 themes, like science. The first is science and society, then research, environment. The third one is science education and outreach. And the fourth is Global Young Academy and SDG. All the activities fall under those 4 themes. And under those themes, we have working groups, incubator groups, focus areas, strategic projects, grants. And one of the grants is Sasha Kagansky Interdisciplinary Grant. This grant was named after an active late member, Alexander Sasha. So among the working group, then we have Science Advice Working Group with our 2 wonderful colleagues, Giovanna Mix from Switzerland and Laura Zimmerman from US. They have been done a wonderful work leading the group to support, empower, and connect early scientists across the discipline in policy making in global. So one of the activity we had recently is organizing a masterclass on science advice, transdisciplinary global science advice on policy and diplomacy. It was done during a few weeks ago during the General Assembly meeting in Washington, D.C. of the General Assembly meeting of the Global Young Academy in Washington, D.C. So we had experts from International Science Council, International Network for Governance Science Advice, and also Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator. So I will just stop there, and we share maybe the link in the chat for those who want to know more about the Global Young Academy. And I will conclude by saying that we are really happy to be part, really honored to be part of this webinar. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Jamru. In fact, we are very grateful that you could join us. I know it has been at very short notice, so thank you very much, and also thank you very much for your insightful introduction into the world of GYA, and also your numerous activities in the realm of science advice. Thank you very much. I have the pleasure now to invite Dr. Natisha Duki, who is a CEO Research Specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council, South Africa. She's here in representing the SAYAS. So for a brief introduction, and thank you very much, Dr. Duki, for being a partner in the project. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Prof. Samtali, very much. Good morning, everyone. And I want to start by saying thanks so much to our partners, which is MAST, ASSAf, and GYA, for giving the South African Young Academy of Science this opportunity to participate in this critical and important collaborative effort. We are really pleased to be part of this. I'm not going to go into great detail because I think my colleagues have said everything that needs to be said, but to say that SAYAS serves as a voice for young scientists in South Africa, and that together with other scientists, we aim to be that powerful voice of scientific excellence as we tackle challenges in the world. And I think this project is crucial in the sense that MAST has come together with these partners, and SAYAS being a part of it, as well as the Global Young Academy as well, and ASSAf as a senior partner in part of achieving the SDGs. I think as we strive to aim to achieve these SDGs in 2030, it is important to start these initial dialogues and to start the work that aims at young scientists, and specifically female young scientists, which SAYAS strives to aim for, is vital as we hope to achieve our endeavors. So I want to thank the partners for this opportunity. We are here to support you and participate as actively as we can. And I know that this is the start of a fruitful relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Duki. That's for your encouraging words, and also for this partnership, which I think is going to go beyond the lifetime of this project. Thank you very much. The last partner in this NASAC IEP capacity building project is the Mauritius Young Academy Initiative. Unfortunately, members of the Mauritius Young Academy Initiative are not available today. So I shall read a short text on their behalf. But certainly they have assured us that they would join us, during the course of the implementation of the project, and they would play as SAYAS an active role. So the initiative in Mauritius was started in 2015 by Dr. Vidushi Niagin, who is herself a Global Young Academy member. The initiating academy has been involved in several important activities. For instance, the second Africa Young Academies Regional Conference entitled Empowering the Next Generation of Scientists in Africa. This conference took place in Mauritius in 2016. It brought together representatives from all existing national young academies in Africa, as well as national young academies initiatives and young scientists from other countries in the NASAC network, together with the NASAC member academies. In addition, a workshop on policy direction, eradication of hunger, and achievement of food security was co-organized by SAYAS and Tanzania Young Academy of Science and Mauritius Young Academy of Science Initiative in April 2018. The initiative also organized a project on addressing COVID-19 challenges in the SADC region, again in partnership with SAYAS in 2020. So with those words, we have ended this first part, which is our introductory part, and we've reached the part where we're going to hear our resource person, and we have, of course, Dr. Justin Germo is going to come back to give us some, her insight into this part of setting the scene. So I have possibly here the opportunity to give a little bit more detail about Dr. Justine Germo, a bit of her background. She's a plant biotechnologist by training at the Institute of Medical Research and Medicinal Plants, where she's the Deputy Director of Research for Valorization and Innovation. She's a gender advocate and science policy trainer with extensive experience in fieldwork and visit, and she has traveled extensively. Since 2017, she has been a member of the steering committee of the Africa chapter of the International Network for Government Science Advice, Global Young Academy, where she served as co-lead in 3 different working groups. So with those words, I invite again Dr. Germo in making her presentation. Thank you, Dr. Germo.
Thank you so much, Prof. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, I think
yes, please proceed.
Sharing. Okay.
Thank you, Glenn.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you again. I am happy to be here, and I will not bring something new because I know one of the mandate of the academy is to bring advice to the government or to policymaker. I'll just give it with the perspective of the working group science advice of the Global Young Academy. So scientists and policymakers have things in common. So they are often driven by a sense of public service and a commitment to making a positive impact in the society, whether it could be with scientific research or policy development. So, but we all know that there is a gap between them, between science and policy. It's kind of dialogue of the deaf between the two worlds. I can see back home in Cameroon, in my country, where there is a lot of research in the lab, a lot of good research in many centers, but the economic development of the country is still like I can say behind. Research doesn't have a good impact as it was supposed to be. Some people have a joke by saying that, what are you searching? Do you ever find something? And it's sometimes embarrassing when we know a lot of hours that people are passing in the lab to be able to come out with research results. But the public or the policymaker can find the same excitement as us. That's where we need to talk about science advice. That's where science advice come in, because it will be able to bridge the gap between the two worlds, between scientists and policymaker. So what means science advice? I found a definition on ChatGPT. It is science advice encompasses the process of providing policymakers with evidence-based insight, expertise, and analysis drawn from scientific research to inform decision-making across various sectors. So I found it a little complete. We talk about science advice, it means also science for policy, and providing those evidence can be done through many ways: sharing experience, capacity building, scientific opinion, statement, report, and other approaches that will help to inform decision-making at different levels. So the role of science advice is then to help link the expectations of scientists and the policymakers, and play a role, kind of, they call it a trust maker, or a kind of referee between them, to be able to take into account divergent perspectives, or diverse expectations. So having all those perspectives and try to have a wise judgment to produce an effective, objective, high quality advice by an expert or a committee, it's more of an art than a science. Prof. Salem said it before. So when we talk about science advice, especially science advice expert, he has a duty. His duty is to bringing down the complexity of data, the statistic, the page of reports. You know how scientists use jargon, how they put a big, like many pages of reports when they have to give, when they have to talk about a specific study they did. So the science advice has this task to bring down this complexity in a way that will help the policymaker. So this image were used by Dr. Vladimir Susha for his keynote speech during INSA 2018. He was saying that science advice expert is the one who has to make sense of knowledge. He has to digest the information, the multiple of available data, to make it comprehensive to decision maker. Now, what is the mechanism behind science advice? We can see here policy cycle. The policy cycle have agenda setting, policy formulation, decision making, implementation, but there are two critical indicators of a well-functioning ecosystem. So the capacity to connect evidence with policy, it can be used through formal or informal mechanism, and the process to make it effective. The other one is the capacity to make research and evidence accessible to policymakers. And we have a lot of partners, a lot of stakeholders, funding organizations, scientists, academies, university, the structure, and all that. We need a well-coordinated effort to be able to have good impact and quality of evidence in policy making. So how those mechanisms operate? We have different practice. Hopkins present 3 types of practice: linear practice, practices where we have kind of shared information between scientists and policymakers. They communicate. The policymaker can act for a specific request, and the scientists respond to that request. We call that linear practices. The other one is relational practices, is to build a partnership among scientists and policymakers. So each part will try to build certain skill to be able to strengthen the partnership. And the third one, the system practice, focus on establish and embed infrastructure. Here we can see a kind of establishment of attractive engagement. It's kind of system that is built among them. We can also have another approach showing the model of relationship between scientists and policymaker. Here we can define 3 types of model. The technocrat model, where science knowledge sustain the decision-making process. Science influence the decision-making process. We can see that science advice has been taken into consideration. I can take example during COVID-19, where expert scientists were together to be able to advise the government to how maybe to use a specific vaccine or this type of treatment against COVID-19. So science in the technocrat model, we can see that science is more predominant, if I can say it like that. The second model is decisionist model. Here, the policymaker lead the decision making. It's more about the vision of the decision maker, the policymaker. He can be aware of some scientific evidence, but what is predominant is his vision as a policymaker. The third one is the practical model, where researcher and policymaker are independent. They are open, both parties are considered. This model is the one that is most required. Oops. Next is this one, okay. For scientists to produce evidence, they can belong to different categories. For example, science practitioner, those who are producing like results, those who are producing the output. We have science communicator in charge of communication. We have knowledge broker. They are those who are able to help decision makers to choose wisely between the available option or on a given issue. They are neutral. It's good because it's the type of scientists that is required in the decision-making process, because they are not influenced by any political view, any ethnic, any funding, any funder or any funding partner, because we realize sometimes the challenge we have in Africa is that sometimes the research don't have impact in the local community because the research has external funder, and external funder usually follow like the desire of the partner. So how to formulate now or communicate science advice to policymakers? To formulate, we need to consider the principle that sustain science advice. First, independence. As we mentioned, the independence, the ability to establish science advice, to organize the work, invite people independently, have access to data, have different source of different perspective, different source of knowledge to be able to be independent. So you have to be independent. The other point is legitimacy. It's a kind of approval, like official approval, if I can say it like that, from the community. It could be scientific community, policy community, political community, also the population. We need to have legitimacy so that it can build also trust when we come with our outcome, with our result, or with our advice or evidence. It needs to be relevant and accessible. Relevant advice, accessible. The other point is the diversity. Diversity in terms of culture, language, knowledge, to avoid misunderstanding or to avoid bias. The last point is to reduce uncertainty. The science advisor is not expected to have a kind of final answer on what he's doing, because there are issues that have not yet well studied to be able to have all the answer to a specific question. So the science advice expert has the ability to clarify what is known, what is not known, to reduce any doubt, to reduce any bias. And now when it comes to communicate evidence to policymakers, we have to consider a lot of aspects. We need to select the information to share with sometimes they may not need to have all the information we have from our research. We need to select the information. We need to find the appropriate time. Their time is not ours. And also, sometime in the lab, we spend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to be able to come out with something. But policymakers don't have also time to wait until the research process is done. We need also, when we communicate with them, to make sure that the advice we are bringing is needed from them. We need also, another way in general is to be in their shoes, go and see policymakers and ask what they need so that we could be able to bring some evidence. So why should we need science advice? Why science advice to policymakers is important? Peter Grubman mentioned it well through this point. The first, demystifying the complex system to policymakers. Because the world is facing several challenges and several changes. It affects the community, it affects policymakers too. So science advice has this ability to provide good expertise, evidence-based information, credible advice, to help them understand what is going on, to help them develop a good strategy so that it could have a better impact when they are taking decisions. And it's really good to acknowledge this aspect of science advice in policymaking, because in general, when we see the gap between developing world and developed world, global north or global south, it's science. It's the gap in science, effectively. And as the world is facing challenges, we need to bring science at the table. Decision makers need to take the right decision to address those different challenges so that we will be at least like resolve the community problem and also be at least at the level of competition with other countries. The second point I will mention here is guiding policy pathway from developing to evaluating and adapting strategy. So science advice here will provide update information on scientific research, technological development, potential risks, benefit with the possible option that exists. And also here it could respond to policymaker requests. The third one is the risk assessment management. We saw it during COVID-19. So when there is natural disaster emergency, We need science advice to mobilize the different source of knowledge, pertinent knowledge, to help to address the crisis or the emergency. The fourth one is navigating tomorrow, forecasting technology and innovation. Science advice inform policymakers about the latest scientific discovery, technology advancement, innovation that will benefit the society. And there's one point that is important, science diplomacy, because it will capacitate the policymaker at the table of negotiation amongst nations. Usually with African countries, we have in mind that we have natural resources, but those natural resources need to have added value. And we cannot always rely, on external expertise. We can have our own expertise, add value. Then at the table of negotiation, we will not just bring like basic effort, if I can put it in bracket. And the last point to consider is the public trust and accountability. Transparent and credible science advice have public trust in government decision-making, because with scientific evidence, they can enhance the accountability, the legitimacy, the transparency, the confidence, and provide the cooperation among the stakeholders. So now we can talk about the challenges. We saw the challenges in science advice, the principle, like be able to follow up the principle is a challenge, because it needs effort, it needs expertise, it needs to include many aspects. We have the time when we have to give advice, the time, how to communicate it also. But we need to see it as an opportunity to build a relationship, decision maker with science advisor, expert, to exchange, to have better impact in the society. So a strong and sustainable science advice needs trust, strong trust relationship among actors, co-creation of research, inclusive implementation with joint reflection, and sometimes face-to-face engagement. If I just have to come on the working group science advice, as I mentioned earlier, the group has this objective to support, empower, and connect early career researchers across disciplines in policy making. They do that by training, capacity building. They organize events, also they apply for funding in their activities. So we can see here some of the activity of the working group, like a report meeting. This was a meeting with international partner from science policy and diplomacy in December. We participated to COP28 in Dubai. We had also some collaboration with science, with working group among science advice. We also, as I mentioned, organized a masterclass on transdisciplinary of global science advice. We had a resource center. This resource center was created through a call where we selected some articles where Global Young Academy member will pre-digest it to make it accessible to the big public, to the policymaker. So it was a kind of competition under 3 themes: government scientific advice, science policy making, science diplomacy, and science communication. So we had winners where you can see in our website some result of the contest entitled like anyone advising advisor, scientists at the policy interface. We have like how to navigate to how to literature on influencing policy. The other one is Red Reading Hood and the Big Bad Wolf, advice for effective science advice and communication. So I'll just end here by saying that having scientific expertise is good, but understanding the policy dynamic to impact policy making will have more impact in our society. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joe. I think it's been a very, you've broken down the elements making up science advice into those nuts and bolts, and we have a better grasp, I think, of what it is really. Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. And also, it's interesting to know about this resource center, which is there and which is accessible. So that would be very useful. We have a few minutes for questions, and I would like to ask the participants if you have any questions. Please go ahead and ask your question to Dr. Gerbo. Otherwise, you can also put your questions in the chat. So, any questions for Dr. Gerbo? Maybe just while waiting for question to come up, Dr. Gerbo, you mentioned science diplomacy. So, what is the difference when we talk of science advice and we talk of science diplomacy? Are they interchangeable, or are they different fields?
Yes, science advice actually is bringing evidence, science advice to policymaker, bringing evidence, scientific evidence to stand policymaker decision. Sometimes it's a kind of a little more, I can say maybe internal, but science diplomacy, has different aspects where science also can sustain some negotiation among the states when we use science as tools to sustain the decision, or maybe during signing the agreement among countries. So diplomacy is more about country, and science advice to government or policymaker is a little more, I can say it's a little more local, or maybe just national. This is my understanding of science advice to government.
And can the same persons do both, or are they?
Yes, definitely. I think we can just be capacitated with different, maybe bit more expertise if we have to come out from our, from science advice to government to go to negotiate the things among states. We need to have a good understanding. But the principle of science advice or during the negotiation seems to be the same principle. Like it has to be independent. It has to be have diverse point of view. That's what I can say. But I think senior academy can know that better than me, and I'm willing to learn more about that.
I think you've done justice to the question, and we have a better understanding now the differences between the two. Thank you very much. I think we just about reached. We were on time, but I think we can move to the next presentation. And as I mentioned, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. We have now a presentation by Dr. Susan Welsman. Dr. Welsman is director of the scholarly publication unit at ASSAf. She's responsible for driving the open science agenda to raise visibility, discoverability, accessibility of South African scholarly journal, and to improve the quality of research output, and support the development of policy framework in order to facilitate the optimal use and access to publicly funded research. She received the Electronic Publishing Trust Award for outstanding contribution to the promotion of open access in developing countries. And recently she was the co-chair of the IAP report on combating predatory journals and conferences, which was launched in March 2022. So with that introduction, I have a pleasure to invite Dr. Versman to present, to give her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Samtali. Very nice to see you this morning for us, and I suppose this afternoon for you. Then also a very good morning to other board members or council members of MAST, and of course all the participants on the group. So as you've heard, I'm Susan Veldsman, I'm the Director of the Scholarly Publishing Program, where we mainly look at scholarly output in South Africa and everything that goes with that. I just want to check Professor Samtali. I assume it's Dr. ASSAf Samtali that had her hand raised, and I'm just wondering whether she wants to still continue or do she wants to wait until I've done with my presentation.
No, it can wait. Susan, it can wait. I'll just put it in the question and answer, and I've already written the question. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Right, I will then proceed. I just want to check whether my slides are visible and whether I'm seeable and whether I'm audible before I actually proceed then with my presentation. Fulani, can you at least confirm, please?
Can you put on slideshow mode, please?
On presentation mode.
So you can see the one with the two.
With the two screens, yes, not on presentation mode. And also to request the previous speaker to stop sharing if everybody's still sharing their screen.
Sorry, do you have it?
That's fine.
Is
That's
it okay
fine.
now?
Yes, that is perfect.
Thank you. I'm sorry. I don't know why there's a conflict and then every time I have to struggle. Anyway, so thank you very much for this opportunity. And it's very nice for me personally actually to switch gears to start talking this morning about science advisory of national science academies. And I would like to just very briefly also speak about the scholarly publishing as a case study. I would like to just start off and just sort of share with you how our road at the Academy of Science of South Africa started with science advice. We are about 24, 25 years old currently. And so we're still also a very young academy, and we also sort of have to build the road as we go. And our sort of attention was drawn to science advice. What does it actually mean? And that it actually has a very particular role between science academies and policymakers, government, etc. And that there are many sort of role players in the science advice arena of things. Professor Samtali, I loved your question about what is the difference between science diplomacy and science advice, because I think they're actually brothers and sisters of each other. And I think if you do science advice, there's no ways that you can do it without science diplomacy. If we look at the science diplomats that we have, especially in our Department of Science and Innovation, you know, it's an art, it's a trick, and how they go about and how they work with politicians to convince them about their case, etc. There's certainly a lesson for us to learn. And I think you're dealing with science advice today, but I could really recommend perhaps one could also look at science diplomacy. because it's really sort of a personality trait that you have to have, and how to engage with science and with policymakers, etc. It's not that easy, and it's quite complex, and it's a very dangerous ground that one sometimes tread in. So just as sort of my way of also answering that question. So we started back, and in about 2014, and I saw that my previous speaker, Dr. Kumba, actually referred to him, and that is Professor Gluckman as well. He sort of raised the bar for us in South Africa to show us what exactly is science advice. But that it's not just a matter of doing consensus studies and putting it out there, that we have to understand the role that we have to play as a science academy, etc. So there are many challenges that's confronting modern society, and because of the scientific nature, sort of emphasizing the importance of scientific advice. And I've listed them all, and it will resonate with us all. We're talking about food sustainability this morning and food security. So in 2014, the workshop on science advice then was hosted here in South Africa. The first one was actually held in Auckland, New Zealand, and that made us very aware that, you know, there's this quite an art and a science around science advice as such. And that led then to the establishment of the creation of the International Network of Government Science Advice, INSA. So I do want to encourage you to also look and see what they are doing. But then ASSAf adopted science advice as such, and it started in 2016 in Johannesburg with the InterAcademy Partnership, General Assembly and Conference, where we spoke about science advice. That was the main focus. And that was led then to a capacity building workshop on science advice for African stakeholders. And it's now known as InSouth Africa Hub, which is also very important network that we as part of the African continent, although you're not attached to us, we do view you as us. So I think in terms of the work that you're doing, that's perhaps another body that one can tap into and see the work that they are doing to enrich sort of the understanding of science advice. Then just also want to acknowledge that in March 2016, our South African Young Academy of Sciences presented some youth perspectives on science advice, which was a very interesting perspective on science advice, considering that the term and sort of the practice of science advice was still very young and in its infant stages. So there are two main bodies in South Africa that's providing science advice. They're very different, and it took us actually quite a long time to negotiate and to understand amongst ourselves who is responsible for what. So ASSAf then does the more long-term in-depth studies. So academies are not very good at providing rapid response advice. That we must just stand and say to each other and acknowledge that fact, because of how we do things and how we want to reach our objectives and how we see our negotiations and the impact and value of our consensus studies to government. But we have another body called the National Advisory Council on Innovation, NACI. So they more onto the shorter timescale studies of the order of perhaps a few months. They produce concise briefs for the Minister of Science and Technology, very specifically. The area where we're not very good at, and where there's really a gap, and that is in the very short end of the temporal spectrum, when advice is required on a time scale of the order of a day or even just a week or so. But here at ASSAf, we did try to mitigate some of this sort of gap in the short-term and temporal spectrum, and that is then we've established a group with some external funding for the Science Advisory Group on Emergencies, namely SAWG. And it's very important to note the field that they are working in, and they see their work in the remit of when an emergency denotes a serious, unexpected, and potentially dangerous situation. that has either already caused loss of life, health detriments, property damage, or environmental damage, or has a high probability of escalating to cause immediate danger to life, health, property, or the environment. So you can see that they work in a very specific brief and space in which they react. So they do science advice very rapidly, sometimes very controversial. Sometimes it's not what people would like to hear at that point in time, but that group feels it's very important to react where it's necessary to react and to issue especially statements then to government and to the public at large. We must also acknowledge it's just not only science academies that works in this space of science advisory. Let's just acknowledge a couple, and that would be individual scientists, industry or business groupings, non-governmental organizations, science and technology committees, government scientists, advisors to ministers, etc. Those are very important bodies also advising in different capacity under different circumstances. I think here I would actually like to highlight sort of also the indirect role that ASSAf played at the time, namely that many of our members of ASSAf actually participated in the National Council when it was the COVID-19 pandemic to advise not only the president but the minister on an extremely high level. But they were so successful that they even advised internationally. They were part of the WHO expert groups in advice in rolling out the vaccines, etc. So when we define our role as a science advice, we must see it on multi-layered levels and the role that we play there. I think that is very important to understand the impact that science advice can have. Now, for some reason, I'm stuck. Let me just see. There you go. Right, so what are the challenges then facing academies when providing science advice? I think there are three challenges that I would like to highlight. One is one of relevance, of timeliness, and receptivity. So if an academy-initiated consensus study does not align with the current needs of policymakers, it might actually be relegated to dusty bookshelves. I think that's a reality. We have to understand what is the relevance for government in a particular time to actually do a consensus study, bearing in mind that it takes a couple of years to actually produce some results and some recommendations and where it would have some impact. Very important in deciding which consensus studies will be done. So this does not necessarily imply that only the studies requested by government should be undertaken. Sometimes we have to preempt some situations. We have to have foresight of the challenges which might face a particular country. And based on that, consensus studies could also then be identified. What is very important of the panels and of the people participating in those science advice is that those academicians must be sufficiently alert and practicized in their fields. So one do need the energy also of the experts in the field to identify the relevant problems whereupon government should be advised. So they will then be in the position to identify emerging topics and embark on studies that will then be useful to policy makers, regardless then of the genesis. So the relevance, just to continue a little bit on that point, is also it relates to the scope and the focus of the study. And then again, the recommendations and the findings must be precise, concise, targeted, and useful. So that must be basically very practical for government and to see for government where actually to plug those findings and recommendations into their policy making processes. I want to move to timeliness now, and that is that the timing of the study must be right, because that will also then enhance the relevance of the particular study. Then my third point I would like to highlight is the one of receptivity. So a report will have a limited impact on policy if government is unwilling or unprepared to receive the advice. And we actually have two very good examples of this particular point. In 2007, ASSAf did a report on HIV/AIDS, TB, and nutrition. And it was published at the time when the government held very alternative views about the cause of AIDS. But the interesting thing was, although this report did not fly very well locally in our country, it attracted major international attraction and comments and uptake, etc. So it was a difficult one, but it's still standing, still there to be cited and to be used. And I think that's the value of that report. Another one which was quite daring, I would almost say, from the Academy of Science in South Africa. We did it in conjunction with two other African academies, and that was the one in 2015, which referred to the diversity in human sexuality, the implications for policy in Africa. And it really drew some very bold conclusions based on recent scientific evidence. So again, locally, people really embraced the findings and the recommendations and welcomed the insight that this study actually brought to the table, and which was then took of many of these organizations which deals with human sexuality, etc. And this report also dispelled many myths surrounding human sexuality, which was very important at the time. But it was not successful in the rest of Africa. It was not very well accepted, and the uptake is still till today extremely low, and not perhaps cited as one of our best consensus studies, because it really challenged the widely held belief systems underpinned by legislation, and it really took courage from us to actually pinpoint African governments to what is wrong and what could be done. So it was actually very disconcerting for us, specifically here at the ASSAf, and that is that the large number of science academies in Africa that refused to endorse the evidence-based report. In all probability, because the evidence challenged official government positions or belief systems in those countries. So that were really two that we would like to highlight as perhaps not being as successful. But then one of our reports, which has been extremely successful and had huge impact and value in our national system of innovation, and have brought huge policy changes into scholarly publishing in South Africa, is specifically three reports. It's the one of 2006 and 2018, which reported on research publishing in South Africa. And then in 2009, that reported on scholarly books, what is their value and what do they bring to the table in terms of research output in South Africa. As I stated there, it had huge effect and impact on the research output policy of the Department of Higher Education and Training, which was published in 2005 and revised in 2015. Until today, ASSAf has a huge role and impact to play into the Department of Higher Education and Training's university policy, and especially in terms of research output in South Africa as such. And we are recognized as a trusted organization, and we are called upon for advice and for putting panels together and to help with research output and evaluations in South Africa. So all these recommendations, and what was interesting in 2006, you must remember, it was just at the dawn of democracy in South Africa, where the higher education system in South Africa had to change, because prior to 2006, only technicons and universities, well, they were distinguished between the two in terms of their funding. They were not funded on equal level. Also the historical disadvantaged institutions, which was part sort of our our strategies before 2004, before our democracy. You know, there was some quite discriminating practices there, also not only in terms of the funding, but also in terms of the institutions. And then ASSAf was actually contracted to look at research output of the different institutions. And that led then to these reports, and these reports were then embraced into the research output policy of government. And that led to an increase in the research output in this 25 years, if I do my sums correctly, yes, almost 30 years in terms of our research output. It has multiplied 5 times, so which is massive, because our researchers are being rewarded for publishing their articles, etc. But it brings along some other problems like unethical publishing practices, but that's a discussion for another day. And of course, we also host the CLO South Africa platform, open access, full text quality journals published in South Africa. So what are the limitations of science advice in the policy-making arena? So policy is rarely determined by scientific evidence alone. We must remember that. We must not think that only science advice can change policy, etc., or only science advice will instigate policy and the route it takes. I think that's a realism that we must acknowledge to each other. And that the advice being provided sometimes will be viewed even as separate from the policy-making process. Again, it relates to the first point. But then advice should also be based on the best available information, which underpins objective conclusions and recommendations to policymakers. And I think it's that objectiveness that's very important in the work that we do. And that's a very strong point for doing consensus studies and putting the recommendations forward. And that sometimes policymakers actually elect not to follow the advice, despite all our efforts and the good reports that we have produced. So it's quite a tough realism to actually come to grips with. There might actually be, and this is where we start to wade into the waters of science diplomacy, and that there might be competing and compelling considerations that have little to do with scientific evidence, such as financial constraints, public opinion, political obligations, etc., which will lead to a consensus study with its recommendations not being uptaken. So that is just the realism we have to face, etc. I just want to also speak a little bit about the difference between advice and advocacy. So advocacy for me reflects the interests or the value systems of the party that provides that information. And such responsible science-based advocacy differs from science advice, but may still have a place. So it strays sometimes into the advocacy terrain, and it's very dangerous for academies, is to advocate. But then our role as science academies is to give objective, impartial science advice. We are the bodies that should provide transparent advice. And we should also be transparent about our biases and how it might actually influence the conclusions we have reached. So non-governmental organizations typically will fall in this category line. Yeah. At the heart of academy advice is the reputation for honest, objective, and unbiased advice. And if we do any damage to these attributes, it would place our advisory function at risk and render our advice as questionable. Just some tips there. If I can just say a few words around the confidentiality of science advice. So sometimes there is a need for confidential science advice, but that is not a role that should be fulfilled by academies. Academies' advice is valued for the fact that it's transparent and that we do not hide behind all sorts of things. Also, we must publish our reports in the public domain. It's public monies, must go into the public space, open, accessible, open and transparent. So there might be other bodies that is suited for this type of science advice. And then the distinguish between those bodies and academies in respect of the science advisory roles should remain. So we should really distinguish ourselves then. But the responsibility we also have as academy is that we must strengthen the notion of a science advisory ecosystem. We must view science advice in this ecosystem as I started off when I explained. And we must also be very distinct about the synergistic role for all these ecosystem components. I hope that has been helpful. And I do thank you for the opportunity to talk about science advice within the Academy of Science of South Africa. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dasman. I can assure you it's been very helpful and enlightening for us, and to know more, to know the context and the science advisory ecosystem in South Africa, showing us some of the pitfalls and many valuable lessons to be learned there. So thank you very much. I think we are just running a little bit out of time, and maybe we can take questions later on after the presentation by Dr. Jermo. So welcome back, Dr. Jermo, for your presentation on advancing inclusion in science advice. And after that, we can take a question, but please go ahead and put your questions in the chat box. Don't be shy.
Thank you, Prof. I will share my screen again. Can you see my screen?
Yes, you can. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Again, I will talk about advancing inclusion in science advice. So imagine a world where different voices are heard, different perspectives are valued in decision-making process. We will just see science bringing its transformative power to address positively and effectively the challenge the world is facing today and meet the need of the community. So when talking about inclusion, many things come in mind, so such as gender, ethnicity, age, minority, culture, knowledge like marginalized community. So what matters is not knowing that each entity is important and can give a different perspective, but what is important is that they can be included, especially when we are talking of science advice, that along the process, from having the result till to giving the advice to policymaker, that we have them include, all the entity include in the process. And inclusion is not just about participation. We need to see who are the beneficiary of the inclusion, or whose issue are addressed, who has access to opportunity, to information, and whatever. This figure illustrates more the perspective of inclusion in science policy. It suggests that when actors are actively engaged, their impact is greater and the policy goals are more effectively established, especially policy that primarily view inclusion as an anchor. It tends to treat individual being included as a passive recipient. So when entities are active in the process, it has more impact. I will just talk about maybe two aspects to consider in the inclusion in science policy arena. First is knowledge, and especially traditional knowledge. Why traditional knowledge? Because effective and impactful, sustainable policy can't be dissociated with diverse knowledge, and in Africa, especially traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge. Because we are talking here about knowledge, treasure, skills, practice, know-how, competencies that have been transmitted from generation to generation for centuries, and this knowledge are sometimes reservoir of knowledge, of assets able to address the challenges the world is facing today from all angles. We can see land management practice, biodiversity conservation method, strategy to mitigate climate change, environmental degradation, and health. We all know that in Africa, 80% of the population rely on traditional medicine for their primary health care. It is the statistic of WHO. So traditional knowledge is something deep into the environment of the community. It's based on observation. They observe the nature, they observe the plants, the animal, how they move as an indicator of maybe coming weather, of changing in the climate. They can observe the water, the sea, the color of the sea, the wave, the strength of the wave, even the sky, the color of the sky, the cloud, to see whether it will be windy day, there will be warning on weather also. So bringing all those knowledge that has been shaping the behavior of the community is important when we have to address different sources of knowledge. Science brings its own lens of its own invaluable lens, but to have an holistic approach, a fair and holistic approach in decision making, the different view like traditional knowledge need to be included in the decision process. So how to do that? There are few steps to be considered. The first one is to engage with local community or indigenous community and develop a very genuine partnership and collaboration with them. This has to do with co-creating research agenda, co-production, involving community members in design, in data collection, prioritize their perspective also. It's kind of win-win situation where they will be happy to participate. The good thing with this inclusive approach is that it's not just confirming an existing model of knowledge or a method that exists, but it also generate new hypotheses. We can have also new discovery, and now we can have a more larger societal concern address. By including knowledge also, it will avoid a kind of conflict of resource management, of knowledge of culture, or practice of those community, local or indigenous community. There is an example that is used, biocultural conservation. This allows the conservation of the biological environment founded on cultural value, on traditional knowledge, practice, and belief. The second point is to build the capacity of the community and empower them, provide training, resources, support data collection, analysis, interpretation, protect their data. Many countries have signed international agreement to protect the indigenous knowledge. For example, we can have the Nagoya Protocol, which is a supplementary of the Convention of Biodiversity, on the access of genetic resources. It stipulates that it should be a fair and equitable sharing benefit arising from the utilization of those genetic resources and the traditional knowledge associated to those resources to be able to have a sustainable use of the biodiversity. So the local community need to understand this type of agreement. They need to know their rights. They need to know their duty, their benefit, any opportunity that could arise. The third point that I can mention is having them at the table. When we have them at the table, we can consider their knowledge in the policy making process. They are not just a source of information, a source of resources, but they need to be part. We need to prioritize their voices, their perspective also. This may involve establishing mechanisms for meaningful participation in policy development, resource management, even in government structure. Some prefer to put at the table scientists from or experts, science advice experts from those local communities because they can know the both reality, like scientific reality and also their culture. Why is it important to include the traditional? I can take an example. I mentioned earlier how the statistic about 80% of African population relying on traditional medicine for their health care. I just try to imagine myself, a policy related to healthcare system where the traditional knowledge or the traditional medicine are not part of this policy. It means that it cannot stay for long, or it will address a wrong challenge or a wrong issue of the community. Now, the second point to consider in inclusion, the second aspect that I want is the language and the culture. Languages are the backbone of knowledge system. We are in the planet where all information cannot be provided by a single language. The world has about 7,000 languages, and my country, Cameroon, has like 300 languages, not dialects, 300 languages. And statistics shows that every 40 days, a language dies. And if nothing is done in the end of the century, like half of the language will die. I can say 3,500 languages will die. And science advice system using just one knowledge system may not address the whole picture or the whole challenges the community is facing. And one knowledge system can't have the same interpretation in the other knowledge system. That's why also there's a need to develop a kind of lexicon that could be among the different system of knowledge to be able to have a genuine translation of knowledge. Concerning language also, language and culture can't be dissociated. And they say that the culture, what we see as a culture of a specific community is kind of iceberg. We just see a little part of it. The big part is inside. And to be able to get into the culture of a specific community, we need to know their language. And we need to know that, and the language has to do also, the language, what they communicate in their culture is a set of knowledge that can't be get rid of when we have to take decision. There's a project of Rokia Balo. She's the chair of INSA Europe. She worked on influence of culture and languages on science advice in Europe. So the aim of the project was to investigate the impact of language, culture, and context on the dissemination and utilization of science advice in Europe, and to examine the potential implication for future practice and research. It shows that cultural and linguistic factor may lead to source of knowledge being ignored when advice is being prepared or advice being less effective in informing decision, and that could be less effective in decision than it could be. So she presented 2 cases where the language was shown is important in a practical way, like practical application of language, like when language is deployed in science advice in terms of inclusion, exclusion of language, how it's translated, and also language as an indicator of different cultural challenges. Here that we can talk about some dominance of language, some underrepresentation of language. I will just conclude by this part by just mentioning few points to consider during inclusion. That a policy cannot be global if you have to, we cannot use a global policy to address a specific issue in community. So we need to take into account their challenges, their culture. We need to engage the community. We need to develop a cross-cultural dialogue to address the power imbalance, respect their right to have an effective policy making. I will share my experience in science advice with INSA. I had the opportunity to be a member of the steering committee of INSA Africa since 2017, steering committee of Africa chapter. So our able new chair is from Mauritius. Her name is Dr. Shahin Motolatimol. So INSA as a platform provide opportunity to improve the ability on science advice, inform government decision-making on developing a better public policy, and lead the continental discussion on science advice. So we organized in 2019 a workshop in Cameroon, in Francophone Central Africa, workshop on science advice. It was the first one. And we produced case study to use during the workshop. One of the case study was Gonzwana. Gonzwana, it's about food insecurity and new technology. I talk about this because the workshop is about food insecurity, and food insecurity is a great challenge the world is facing today, and Africa particularly. So where the statistics show that 50% of the African population are suffering for acute food insecurity. So maybe when we say 50%, we can just see it like a small, maybe a small number. We don't have an exact figure of what it is. It means that 750 million of people in Africa are suffering from acute food insecurity. We really need to address that urgently. That's why I really appreciate this initiative from MAST and its partner. I'm really looking forward to see the outcome of this workshop, which could probably inspire other African countries. So if I have to talk about Gonzwana, the case study Gonzwana, Gonzwana is a country. It's a fictive case, but very close to the reality. Gonzwana is a fictive country, primarily agricultural. The country is poor and rely on small income for production as well as tourism. Agricultural practices are mainly traditional and for subsistence, and farmers are not always able to keep grain reserve from one year to the next year. And a decade ago, Gonzwana adopted a policy regulating the use and marketing of genetic modified organisms by encouraging the use of modified seeds to stimulate the yield. They do not understand why they must source their seeds from foreign business years after years, and fear that they will not be able to purchase them due to the political crisis and economical crisis. On the other side, there are several foreign entities that acquire a large space there to do intensive agriculture, and local communities see it like a threat in their traditional way of life and employment prospect, and share that they will not be able to support their family. Because Gondwana doesn't possess the necessary infrastructure, foreign national dominate the seed, fertilizer, herbicide, pesticide market. So now there is four issues here. First, the researcher in Gondwana put in place a genetic modified insect that could be released in our environment to be able to disrupt the white locusts that were eating like all the plants in the ground. Secondly, there is a funder organization which have to set in place a high-tech hub to produce this type of locust modified, genetically modified. And then you position the country and as leader and will be a source of income. The third point is like the FAO, the World Food Organization, locust informative say that there will be in 4 to 6 weeks an invasion of locusts. And then we have fourth, the Association of Farm Business. We're pressuring the state about the challenges the country will face. So what element then should the government, what element should the government science advisor consider in his report? I present this case just to show the complexity that science advisor face, a conflict of structure, conflict of perspective, conflict of benefit, to be able to have an independent advice to the government. Sometimes we mentioned that one of the challenges of science advice is the short time period to give an advice so that you will be able to see all the entities, study all aspects, be with all the different aspects in every domain possible to be able to bring a valuable advice. Another point that I want to mention here is to see the complexity of food insecurity. It touches many different aspects: availability, access, utilization, stabilization, and all those stakeholders involved. It's a challenge. It's really challenging. I will just maybe continue with the challenges. Just stop that aspect and continue with the challenges when we have to talk about the inclusion. Translate the evidence. When we have inclusion, many parts include. To translate evidence, sometimes we can there could be misinterpretation, misunderstanding in translating. Underrepresentation here, we can have some community that could not be represented, some structure that could be represented. Maybe we don't have time to get in touch with them in the right time, or they don't have specific expertise to address the specific issue, like access barrier, like languages. For example, my country, I said before that we have 300 languages, and we have 2 official languages, French and English. And so if you have to address a specific issue in French and English, the majority of the community, or rural community or indigenous community, cannot understand, or they are not even aware of what is going on between scientists and the policymaker. And cultural bias also. So sometimes we need to take that into account, respect the different perspective in culture to have a good science advice. Then come with the recommendation. The recommendation is legislative support. We need to have it at the level of the law. The law needs to support inclusion when you have to take advice, scientific advice, inclusion. Develop innovative way of engaging policymakers as co-creation. So we don't just need to bring them the final result. When we initiate the project with them from the beginning, we design all together, they will be willing to follow up with the activity and see the outcome of the activity. Standard and credible science. We need to put all the structure, all the mechanism to be able to have a credible science, coordinate between science advice channels. There's a lot of organization in the same country in charge of science advice. We have academies, we have like professional organization, minister in charge of research, a lot of them, but it needs a coordinated effort amongst them to be able to have inclusive science advice. Before I finish, I would like to share that in South Africa, as we mentioned, in South Africa, launched a science advice skills development program of the call of mentor and mentee in science advice that will end in July 15. The deadline is July 15. So the aim of the program is to build the capacity of early career and mid-career researcher in Africa continent, and to have to effectively practice science advice. So I will end there and say thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jimo. It's been really, we see from your presentation the holistic approach that is required, the inclusivity. We need to consider languages, traditional knowledge. All these need to be part. So it's really complex. It's not just academics talking about science advice in their universities and the labs, but we need to go out there and understand the environment and the people around. Really, I think we can see that it's not simple. What we think is possibly much more academic, but it's go much further than that. And a policy cannot be global; it has to address a specific issue. And you touch on the aspect of Gondwana, the food security aspect of it. So I think that would be interesting also for our next meeting next month. And by the way, Dr. Shaheen Timol is attending the webinar. The chair of the INSA Africa chapter she's present here. So thank you, Dr. Jim. We have time for a few questions. And we have a question from Dr. Huda Nitu. Dr. Nitu?
Yes.
Could you
good afternoon, everybody. I have a question for Dr. Justine. Actually, it's in relation to your first presentation. You mentioned earlier that when formulating policies, it's a very independent exercise. But I was just wondering if we have the science practitioners or the experts who are based at an institution which is, let's say, hypothetically, it's government funded. Is it okay? Are they independent enough to be providing advice to the government?
Oh, thank you so much for the question. Yes, this question comes a lot during the discussion on science advice, like be independent of the funder. As science advice, there is the principle to follow. We need to give independent advice. If you don't give independent advice, maybe I can say the outcome of it would not be like kind of logic, will not be unbiased. Independent advice is not difficult, it's not easy, but we need just the science advice expert need to follow that principle to be independent, find different sources of knowledge, contact which aspect you want, have access to certain knowledge to be able to produce a good advice, effective advice of high quality. If not, it will not be of high quality, and the impact will not be that. Maybe it will just follow the government of the political maybe vision that may not have a big impact in the local community.
Thank you. And Dr. Samtali, can I ask a second question as well?
I don't know if I'm able to answer that one.
In fact, I have a question again for Dr. Justine. And that's also in relation to the second speakers who mentioned that policy is never based on the science alone. And you mentioned, inclusion of different factors. You mentioned one of your models for science and policy is the integrated model. Besides the science practitioners and the policymakers, shouldn't the industry also be part of the conversation, since price, there are a lot of economic factors which also come into play. I was wondering, why is industry not in the picture? Thank you.
Oh no, there are other stakeholders in the picture. I just presented scientists. Scientists could be those who produce like knowledge. The other one can communicate. The other one can advocate. But actually, the system that works better is the one with like 4 elites, like the university, the government, the scientists, the university, the government, the industry, and also the, how do they call it, the association, the professor, the NGO, because they are the one who know better the needs of the local community. They can advocate for them. So when we have a research that have all those 4 components, it can be a little more inclusive.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your detailed answer.
Dr. Welsman, you would like to intervene? Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Samtali. I just want to sort of elaborate also what Justina said. We must remember, if we give science advice to government, it's never from a person to a person. What science academies do is that they constitute panels, expert panels. And in these expert panels, they have various stakeholders represented there. For instance, we have just concluded a study on nuclear technology, safe ways how to use nuclear technology. And we had a huge contingent of panel members of the business sector, etc., into the energy sector that contributed to that particular consensus study. And I think the key is also in consensus studies. So in consensus study, it means that the panel actually reaches a consensus. So that sort of eradicates the biasness maybe of the individual. It also it sort of balances the expertise, if I can put it that way. It allows one to apply different lenses to a particular problem. So I think that's the magic of academies, is that they can get these panels together and do a consensus evidence-based study on which they could advise government as such. I hope that is helpful. Thank you, Prof.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Welsman. Dr. Yusuf Modabakas has a question or a comment. Yusuf?
Yes, thank you. And I have a question for Dr. Welsman especially, but it could also be open to Dr. Justine. I know that ASSAf has been very active in providing policy advice to the South African government. And of course, they had the reports on nutrition, on HIV, on TB, and others. Now, I guess that some of this were solicited by government and some were unsolicited, which means that ASSAf itself provided the advice to government without being solicited by government to do so. My question is, how successful were this advice? Because I think Dr. Welsman used a very interesting wording in her presentation, which was receptivity. And I think that's the key word. So how receptive was government with regard to the various policy advice provided to government. And of course, I mean, this also applies to GYA in case they have been providing advice. How successful have you been in providing advice to government? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you very much for that question. I'd like to respond that and say, as it was clear in my presentation, that there are various levels of acceptance by government. I think if I can just very generally think about the consensus studies that we've done thus far, if they have been commissioned by the government, then I think the likelihood is there that they will accept and implement those recommendations we've made. And I think then I'll go to the next level to say those that we have initiated ourselves might not have been as successful as we wished it to be, but I would like to highlight two other studies that we've done, which was not commissioned by government as such, but which had major impact into the science system of South Africa. The one was on PhD studies, where we looked at the training and sort of the throughput of PhD students in South Africa. Because again, it was at a time when we were sort of adapting to democracy, and new targets were set down for us to deliver on PhD students. And of course, gender, age, race, etc. then came to play, also to enhance those throughput numbers. That particular study of ours had a huge effect on the system, on the national system as such, in terms of the throughput of PhD students and what needs to be done and whether those targets were realistic, etc. That study is still being quoted by government and other stakeholders in the field. So that was a very important one. There was another one, also during the time of democracy, there was an inclination from government to put a lot of emphasis on science, technology, and mathematics. And also funding was geared more towards these subject fields. But then the humanitarians, how would we call humanities, people from humanities, is they felt that is not fair and the government is really not looking after them and they need to have also a throughput of students, etc. And we did a consensus study on the state of humanities in South Africa, where it actually recommended and it showed the importance of humanities in any discipline, whether it be hard sciences, biological sciences, where humanities and social sciences need to play a particular role. So that led then to also government taking up some particular initiatives to enhance humanities and social sciences in South Africa. So that's, I think that the best advice I can give is when you decide to do a consensus study, it's really to look at those 3 points that I've said, how the timeliness thereof, how applicable it is, etc., and the relevancy thereof. I think that's very important. Consensus studies take long. You need a lot of panel sessions and a lot of drive and a lot of human capacity and financial capacity towards consensus studies. So make sure whatever you tackle that it could be of value and impact to your country. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Fine.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we've finished with that first part of our presentation. We'll have a short break of 5 minutes. I know it's very short, so as we don't run out too much on time, so I'll ask you to be back in 5 minutes, please, for the second part. Thank you very much, and we thank, of course, the two presenters, Dr. Justin Dermo and Dr. Susan Velsman, for the very interesting expose. Thank you very much. So see you in 5 minutes. Hello, Dr. Melusi. How are you? Hi. I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Hi, Melusi.
Ah, hello. Hi.
Maybe try to reconnect, Melusi. The sound is not coming through.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Ah, yes,
So
we can hear you now.
Yes, we can hear you, Melusi, now.
We can hear you.
Thank you. I've just moved over to science, so I don't. Let me see if I can get my
Sure. Yes.
slide from. Okay. Can you allow me to share Kolani?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay. Can I make a short introduction, please? So we have our last speaker of our webinar today, but not the least one. It's Dr. Melusi Swala, who is a professionally an environmental scientist, specializing in water quality assessment and monitoring. Dr. Melusi is manager, science advisory program and strategic partnership at ASSAf. Dr. Melusi's responsibilities include the management of this program, which also includes women in science and young scientists activities. He is a UNESCO Keijo Ubuchi Fellow with a track record of international collaboration and has served in various multilateral organizations. Furthermore, he is an academic who trains research students and serves on the editorial board of scientific journals. He has over 15 years of working experience in research and higher education and has a proven record in science citizenship in both local and international organizations. So with this short, I know, introduction, Dr. Melusi, I leave the floor to you for your presentation.
Thank you, and thanks a lot, Dr. Samtani, colleagues, the leadership of the Mauritius Academy of Science and Technology, MAST, the MAST fellows who are also in attendance. So I see I haven't started sharing this slide. Okay. Is it fine?
No, need to put it on presentation mode, Dr. Melusi.
Oh, okay. Susan, you may have to help me here with your mention. Okay. Let's take it out. Yeah, that's right. Is it fine?
Not on my screen.
Maybe you need to stick full screen.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah, slideshow. No.
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 Melusi, do you mind if ever I share the screen and then you'll proceed while I'm
Okay.
you'll direct?
Oh yeah, I think that you can do that, Kolani.
Okay.
Thank you, Kolani.
Let's see. So I'll stop sharing. So I'll just give you a hint, Kolani, to go to the next slide whenever I need you to. I hope I'm audible now, enough colleagues. Thanks a lot and apologies for that slight glitch. We're having computer issues here. So as you saw earlier on from my computer, there was no audio. So I ran to my colleague's machine here. But it is really a pleasure to be part of this exercise today. We really appreciate the invitation from MAST to this co-learning exercise. I think, at least for me, there's been a lot at least from our GYA 2 presentations, a lot that I've learned, which I think also can be infused into the approach of the Academy of Science of South Africa. But today, what I'll be focusing on is just the approach that we take when it comes to science advice from ASSAf. Obviously, the situation will differ from academy to academy, country to country, and even within a single country, you know, the nature of science advice that is needed and the time or the moment by which it is required will also differ. So there are those dynamics, but I just wanted to, as a starting point, that as the Academy of Science of South Africa, we draw this function from our mandate that we are given by an Act of Parliament. So we are a public institution established through an Act of Parliament. Hence, what we need to offer has to embrace national priorities, but also we do undertake science advice that is of regional relevance and importance, as well as global relevance as well. If you can just go back to the previous one, Kolani. Oh, thank you. And I just wanted to highlight when it comes to that one, that the science advice activity is really not only the mandate, but it's also the goal of the Academy to execute effective evidence-based science advice to national you know, priorities. And I will be highlighting some of those examples as we get into the further slides. But what's important is that the science advice that we offer covers all the science discipline. And I would like to emphasize that because it includes social sciences as well as humanities. And maybe the reason for that, which is generic, is that the problems that society faces today cannot be solved by a single discipline, cannot be solved by, you know, a narrow scientific practice, but we need to draw expertise from various disciplines of science in order to deal with the problems that we face as society today. Next slide, please. My colleague Susan spoke earlier on about, some of the examples of science advice that we've executed, and I would like to go back to the COVID example one that she highlighted on. But maybe as a start, a generic, when I talk to either my family, my mother or my kids, really about what the academy does, I need to make it understandable to everyone. And although there are, definitions in peer-reviewed outputs, but if you think about this, simply talking about science advice, I think Susan spoke that it's not individual to individual, that is something that is important, but it is a collective interpretation and strategic packaging of the latest available scientific information by knowledge experts on a particular topic. And in this regard, we use an example, a recent example, whereby 51 top scientists were brought together to advise the health minister on the country's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, these were experts in virology, in public health, in infectious diseases, in personal protective equipment. And so there were different subgroups within this committee, but they were brought together to guide the country on the response. For example, what are the estimations in terms of the beds, the number of beds that are needed at hospitals, how do we approach, the lockdowns that we had. South Africa had lockdowns from 1 up to 5, with 5 being the most stringent one. How do we move in between these different levels and what informs that? And they had to use the science evidence that was available at that time to inform, the country. Next slide, please. Now, the academy played a key role, in providing experts in that specific, issue of COVID-19. And they then, at a very high level, as Susan also mentioned earlier, that they were either, leading some of the subcommittees, but the whole committee was also chaired by an ASSAf member, Professor Slim Karim, who's a world-renowned scientist when it comes to health and infectious diseases. And what they really were tasked with is almost on a day-to-day basis, engage amongst themselves as the experts, come to consensus. And I will emphasize that again, around the table, what do we feel is the concluding direction or emphasis of the evidence, scientific evidence that we have. And that is what they had to do on a daily basis. But also interestingly, and maybe more excitingly, was the public engagement that was linked to that. For example, Professor Slim Karim, almost on a daily basis, had to come engage the nation during morning time news. He had to field questions from the general members of society about what is this that we are dealing with when it comes to COVID-19, what is the science telling us at that time, and how do we respond. And we are fortunate that we are sitting here today to tell the story or to reflect on this. But when you think about it, we didn't have the full knowledge that we needed at that time to guide government and governments at large, but the latest information or the best available information at that time is what the scientists had to depend on. So it's not your optimal information that you will always have in order to offer science advice, but it is the best information at disposal at that time that can be utilized for science advice. And that is why we require top-level experts to inform or guide us in terms of science advice. Next slide, please. So there's various formats that we adopt as ASSAf in executing or delivering our science advice, and I'll just mention those few. Obviously, I'll delve a bit more into consensus studies because that is the prime, that is the gold standard when it comes to science advice. But we do have policymaker booklets, and I just reflect on that example of that picture that is there. And maybe to respond to an earlier question as well, which was asked around, science diplomacy. This was really one example because in this example for a policymaker booklet, the academies from Cameroon, from Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Uganda, as well as my own South Africa, it came around the table and looked at the data from each respective country and analyzed that and put together this document, which is advising policymakers on the approaches that we can use to reduce child mortality at birth. So that is a prime example of science diplomacy, but in this case, it was actually science diplomacy for policy making. We also use workshops amongst the examples and symposia where we gather experts on a particular topic and engage on what the latest available information tells us, what could be the approaches that could be undertaken. We also made policy commentaries. What that actually is about is when a policy either is being developed, there's commonly opportunities for public comments on policies when they are being developed. The academy can make submissions or make those commentaries at that time, or when the policy actually is out there, it's now being effected or published. Also, the academy is in a space to make those commentaries. Another example is statements which are really brief, a few pages. Sometimes it is actually a single page, whereby experts get around the table to respond to a particular, almost narrow topic, but providing an opinion based on their scientific, based on the scientific evidence that is available. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier on, that consensus studies really are the prime, at least within ASSAf, that we look at when it comes to science advice, and because number one, they take a bit longer, to put together, but they also require a lot of experts in order to deliver a consensus study. And I'll just go into detail around that. But just to highlight some of these examples, some of the latest examples, and really how we end up undertaking science or consensus studies. Now, this example relates to the square kilometer array, which some of you may be aware that South Africa is amongst the privileged within a consortium to host this scientific breakthrough amongst other partners. We host this at a site in the Karoo region within South Africa, but to optimally operate the SKA requires that at least in close proximity of the site, there is narrowing of the radio frequency bandwidth. What essentially that does is that it limits internet connectivity, it limits also cell phone mobile connectivity for those areas that are around. And ASSAf was then requested to look at what options can then be adopted to now enable those communities where they've been restricted in terms of radio frequency bandwidth, what other measures can be put in place to allow them the connectivity that runs our daily lives today. We are connected today from various pockets of the world. It is through such internet connectivity. Another example, if you can just click, is a recent study on the peaceful applications of nuclear technology. Now, this was a commission study, and maybe to put an example on an earlier question, ASSAf was commissioned by the Department of Science and Innovation, as well as the Department of Minerals, Resources and Energy, to do an assessment of where we are as the country in terms of research, development and innovation concerning peaceful applications of nuclear technologies. Now, the study cross-cuts various applications from nuclear medicine to nuclear energy to food production, and also going to water and sustainability. And we had, working teams looking at each pocket of the applications of nuclear technology, and we'll reflect on that again later on. Next slide, please. And getting into moving further into the how do we actually undertake consensus studies? Now, within ASSAf, and I assume across various, academies, there are guidelines on SOP, standard operating procedures, on how you undertake a consensus study, which are rigid. They're not optional. You always need to follow them. And this is how we do it within ASSAf. I think, I'm not certain if you can still see the slides. I do not see them anymore.
Can't see them anymore.
Okay. I see Colin is coming back now. Okay, thank you. I hope we can all see on my side, at least I can see. So, yeah. Phase one, starting with the conceptualization of the study. And, it could be the concept comes from the client if it is a commissioned study, and it could be government, it could be business, or it could be any pocket of society which requires, scientific experts to unravel a certain topic. But also if it's internally, and it could either be proactive. By internal, I mean within ASSAf, it could either be proactive or reactive to a certain eventuality. Now, members can gather and come up with a concept note or an idea, or it could either be council mandating members to look at a particular topic. The next step would then be the proposal development, which articulates what the problem is and also justify why the academy is the appropriate, institution to address such a particular topic. And part of what the proposal needs to actually provide is the experts that are needed to unravel now this question. And then, as I mentioned, we need to work across disciplines and across sectors. Now, council would be looking at that, whether the proposal actually embraces that transdisciplinarity and representativity across, the various pockets. I can, with confidence mention today that the ASSAf Council doesn't accept or approve proposals that do not reflect the transformation agenda that South Africa needs to achieve. If there's no gender representativity or balancing, that does not get approved, at least from council, just to mention that. But then the proposal needs to also outline the plan as well as the budgeting that is required. Then it gets taken to council for consideration. And if council approves, we can then move on to the next slide, which will then be phase two, which is now the execution of the consensus study. I did mention that it takes a bit longer, minimum 18 to 36 months. And, due to the reality of issues on the ground, sometimes they do go beyond 36 months. But the general guide is that it should be minimum 18 up to 36 months, whereby the panel chair So that will be the study leader who chairs the panel, as well as the co-chair, lead the panel of experts in undertaking this study. The study is hosted by the Secretariat, which will include myself, Kolani, and other members of the Secretariat who are present here today, who then provide the support and connect the dots with regards to the study. Now, one of the important things is that during the execution of the study, continuously there is engagement with either the client, if it was a commission study, but also with other sector role players with regards to the sector that the study is actually grounded on. And the purpose of continuous engagement is to ensure that the panel gets the side view opinions from other individuals that are outside the panel. We do not want to wait until the end of the publication of the report to get opinions from other role players. So it is important that once there is, actually even at the beginning, the panel can engage the public just to inform the public about what it seeks to undertake. But as soon as there is meaningful findings to report back on, the panel can also engage the public or other role players in order to communicate the findings at that stage. Next slide, please. Which then is phase 3, which is the review process. Now, also this also what I'm presenting here is the official process of the academy. Once the panel has put together a report, now they are confident that they have succinctly responded to the objectives of the study. They then now put a report together, but also at that point or ahead of the finalization, they can request endorsement from ASSAf Council of the peer reviewers. Now, there's 3 levels which ASSAf consensus studies are reviewed at. The first reviewer must be a local reviewer based in South Africa, operating within South Africa. The second reviewer must be somebody within the continent, so outside South Africa, but based and operating within the continent. And the last reviewer must be an overseas expert that is outside the continent. And I must say that ASSAf Council also is highly, articulate on what needs on the profile of the reviewers that need to assess this work, and also the transformation agenda, when it comes to the paradigms, and the council also requests on that. And then once the reviewers have undertaken their job, then the panel addresses the comments and then submits back to council to consider whether the comments of the peer reviewers have been addressed by the panel successfully and appropriately. And after that, then council can, consider to approve, that consensus study report. I see that we have lost Kolani again. Hopefully he'll come back soon as I speak. But if the study was commissioned by a client, after council has approved the consent study, we can then now have it back to the client for their consideration and endorsement. And maybe I will just have to share on my side. It's really the last 2 slides since Kolani has dropped off. Oh, I see he's back. And Kolani, if we can just go to slide 10 now. The final phase, phase 4. Now, the study has been endorsed by the client. What do we do now? And I'm just highlighting the recent case of the nuclear technologies for peaceful application, we make a big splash about this because number one, the journey is not easy, but also we now want to inform the public at large that here is the study that we are either commissioned. In this case, we are commissioned by the Department of Science and Innovation, as well as the Department of Minerals, Resources and Energy. Our president of the Academy, Professor Bertin, was very excited and was confident that the panel had undertaken due diligence in undertaking the study and handed over the report to the executives of the departments as we launch now the study. And we then undertake what we call uptake activities, whereby we engage the policymakers themselves, because when we're launching, it's such a high level, commonly a high level event whereby either the Director General is the one that is receiving that, but at a later stage we engage, with the officials of that particular department, just to go through at a finer detail about what the study is recommending. Next slide, please. Part of our uptake activities also include engaging the broader public. And the implications of the study can either be mainstream to government, but there could also be considerations or information that is relevant to broader society. And if you think about it, at the end of the day, policy has got implications for the general public at large. So it is important that we engage the public in that regard, and also including or engaging other international experts, because by the fact that we publish the study doesn't mean we can put it nicely into our cupboard, but it is a working document whereby we should not only engage the client, but also further beyond, should there be a need to do so. And I like this slide because not only because there's a representation from the Mauritius Academy in that, hopefully you can see that, but there's also other, academies represented from the continent, from Kenya, Nigeria, and that is what we do because we request also further guidance from our continental counterparts with regards to our studies. Next slide, please. Just to highlight some examples of the currently ongoing consensus studies. The membership of the Academy is well endowed around the health discipline, so we tend to do quite a lot when it comes to the health discipline, because that's when we've got good muscle. But although we work across disciplines, you can see that at least at this moment, some of the studies are either hosted by the health standing committee, but I can assure you that we draw from the different pockets of the Academy, for those studies. And that is something that the ASSAf Council also looks at, whether we do have cross-cutting representation within the Academy in addressing a particular topic. So those are the latest ones that are currently ongoing, which we are hoping to complete this financial year. We've just started our financial year now in April, and it ends in March next year. And we're hoping that all of those will be completed by the end of this financial year. And with that, that is my last slide. I would like to thank you, Professor Samtali, for the opportunity, as well as MAST for the invitation for us to come together on this, as well as the support that we've been provided by the EAP and our mother body within the continent, MAST. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Dr. Merusi. It's really fascinating to see in detail how you proceed, the different phases. It's a very elaborate process, and I think we can learn a lot from that. Do you, a question I could ask you immediately is that, do all the studies have got to follow that process, or some of them could be, let's say you could have a shortcut, or have less elaborate, step-by-step procedure being followed?
Thank you, Professor Mtali. Yes, if it is a consensus study, it has to follow that process. But when a proposal is submitted to council, there could be recommendations to take a different format. As an example, as you saw, there are commentaries, there are statements, policymaker briefs. So council may recommend maybe a deviation from a consensus study into another format. But if it's a consensus study, that is the Bible that we need to follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Do participants have any question for Dr. Melusi? Any questions? No? Yusuf, would you?
Yes, Chair, yeah. Yes. I know that ASSAf has been very successful for two reasons in providing policy advice to government. The first one, it was established as an act of parliament. And the second one is that it has as its mandate to give advice, to give evidence-based science advice to government and other stakeholders. Well, maybe I will try to lump 2 or 3 questions together. The first one is, can ASSAf assume total independence and autonomy by being funded by government in providing advice and otherwise? And secondly, yeah, okay, I'll stop there because I have quite a few questions linked to that one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Yusuf. If I can respond to that, Prof. Samtali. Yes, as you've mentioned that, yes, we are established through an act of parliament, and our funding comes through the Department of Science and Innovation. But the autonomy of the academy, firstly, is ensured by that act of parliament, which actually outlines the governance structure. We've got a board, the council, which is the highest decision-making body of the academy. So that at least ensures that there is robustness within the academic governance and structures. That is one of the ways which actually ensures that, and it is a prescription of the act. Now, I can imagine that at times there are, occurrences of conflict. Now, we do not see any government, department, or organization as being against us. For example, if we're talking about the Department of Science and Innovation, through which our funding comes through, and I would like to emphasize that the funding doesn't come from the department, but it comes from Parliament through the Department of Science and Innovation. It could have well have been another department, that our funding comes through. And so we are not actually reporting to the department as per se, but we are reporting to Parliament, specifically citizens through the Parliament. I hope that addresses your question, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, Yusuf. So you don't have any additional question linked to that, Yusuf?
Yes, but I think I'll give others a chance to ask questions.
Thank you. Any questions to Dr. Melusi, please?
And maybe, Prof, if you can just allow me to add one last remark, is something which I get in touch through Mike, is that science advice we execute it through partnerships. It's not just the academy alone that does that, but through the journey, not only in consensus studies, but the life of the academy should not only be with academia. So we do quite a lot, in engaging government, business, NGOs, like-minded institutions locally as well as internationally, because to a large extent our objectives are aligned. We just come from different pockets. As an academy, we want to see the best national system of innovation. Government departments expect, tools to be coming from the system, the national system of innovation. So we all want a healthy, well-oiled national system of innovation. We're just coming from different pockets. We're not enemies. We all want the same, outcome at the end of the day.
Thank you. Well, maybe two additional short questions. One, do you claim fees to government and other stakeholders when you do these consensus studies for them or providing evidence-based advice? That's one. And second one, myself and the president, Dr. Samtali, were in a conference in Nairobi, and it was on agriculture, so GMOs was very much in the central part of the discussions. And of course, our scientists, most of the scientists, said that there was no evidence that GMOs were bad for health, for example. And on that very same day, or within a few days, government had an act of parliament to ban GMOs, which was in contradiction to the findings of the scientists in their own country. So, well, there was that conflict between the scientists and government. Is that likely to happen in South Africa, or you always come to some consensus?
Thank you, Prof. The second part of your question, if I could just start with that. Yes, that example that you are using, it can happen anywhere in the world. South Africa is not immune to that. And Prof, you may be aware that when it comes to HIV and AIDS, treatment, it was a big battle in South Africa to get to the healthcare system, specifically with regards to HIV and AIDS, whether we're talking about denialism that was there, different approaches. So even from a South African point of view, and I'm using that one because the treatment program that South Africa has when it comes to HIV and AIDS today was not always there. It took a long battle between academics at large, but also ASSAf. A large proportion of our members were at the forefront of that, and I'll call it a fight, because they were pushing for what the scientific evidence was saying and what approaches can be taken to reduce the mortality rate, which we had back then as the country, which is considerably lower than what we face today. So those do happen, Prof, and we cannot avoid them, but at least in this example, science won at the end of the day, and lives are actually being saved on a day-to-day basis. But conflict does happen.
Thank you. And the first part of the question about fees, claim or consensus studies.
Okay. So if it's internal, if it's studies that are initiated by the academy itself, we will budget within our resources that are available for the next 3 years. We normally get what we call funding for at least 3 years. So we know what we likely will have for the next 3 years, although there could be changes from year to year, but we utilize that. But if it's commissioned by a client, it is then up to the panel. And as I mentioned, I think it was phase 1 to appropriately budget for that, depending on what the panel has planned as part of the activities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mdusi, and we would really like to have you again at our next hybrid workshop and to pursue the discussion. So we hope you will be able to make it.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
We've reached the end of the presentation, but I have the pleasure to pass the mic or the floor to Professor Dr. Ghulam Mohamed Bai. Dr. Mohamed Bai is our first Vice President of MAST, and he will give us the key takeaways from the lessons learned from this webinar. So over to you, Professor Mohamed Bai.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Salam, and good afternoon to all of you. I do realize that I am between you and your lunch in South Africa, and I'm between you and perhaps a grossly delayed lunch for those from Mauritius, those who didn't get a chance to have lunch because we're starting at 1 o'clock. But so I'll try to bear that in mind. I think it's been such an informative and enriching. We've heard so many interesting and informative and enriching presentations that I think it's very difficult to do justice to the various issues raised and to list the key takeaways. And you know, each one looks at it in a different way, and I put down certain ideas that I grasped as we went along, and I've just jotted them down, and I thought I'll share them with you. But I think there is room for going deeper into so many of the issues raised today for the benefit of MAST, because after all, this is a capacity building workshop for MAST, and many of the issues need to be unpacked. The first point, I think important point, is we just remind ourselves that science is global. Not just national, but it is global. Global meaning regional as well. And many issues that affect scientific issues that affect a particular country also affects other countries in the region and globally. And the other important point, I think, is that the important role played by young scientists. We have in our presence two young academies, one not present today, but nevertheless, they're active in Mauritius. So it shows that science as well transcends age. The experienced and more knowledgeable, perhaps older scientists, and the more dynamic and full of ideas and so on, the younger ones. And we have to give room to each one of them to have a key role in science advice. The other important takeaway is the partnership among academies. And this is a typical example of what we've had today in this webinar. The partnership between the two main academies in South Africa and in Mauritius, but also the Global Young Academy and the other academies. I think partnership is key to moving forward in everything we do. And I think this is something we must cherish and which continue. We must support each other and learn from each other. So partnership, I think, was very interesting. It became clear that science advice is important to meet global challenges. And policymakers will never be able to address on their own the very key issues of global challenges in particular. And scientists cannot be indifferent to that. They have to help out and come in and see how it can be done. And the key issues are climate change, sustainable development goals, disaster risk management. And one issue that I didn't hear about is artificial intelligence. I think it's a very important issue affecting us globally, on positively and negatively, and it's something we need to look at. So science advice is important, and I think science academies have a responsibility, a duty to pronounce on these many global issues affecting their own countries, but affecting the other countries as well. But clearly, and as was shown by the first presentation that we saw, there is a gap. there is a gap between scientists and policymakers. And there is a need to bridge this gap. And there's a need on the part of academics to demystify science, because policymakers very often are not scientists, and they think scientists live in their little cocoon and do their little work in the laboratories, produce their reports and shelve it and so on. And it's our duty at the level of science academics to demystify that concept and bring science to a national platform, to a general platform, to a platform where everybody can understand, simplified so that everybody can understand what we're talking about and explain some of the issues. We heard that there are many mechanisms, many models, and many ways to formulate science advice. And I think the last presentation of ASSAf made it very clear of the different ways of doing this. For example, by having advisories, by booklets, by workshops, by consensus studies, and so on. So there's no simple way of providing science advice. It's a multiple avenues that one can use. But in providing that advice, I think 2 points that I grasped immediately was the need to have trust and the need to have engagement. And to be able to maneuver between this trust and engagement issues, we need to have science diplomacy. And science diplomacy, as it was said, is complex, and it's a ground which was said can be dangerous. So we have to tread very carefully. But establishing this trust and establishing this engagement is extremely important. We heard about ASSAf, and we heard, and Yusuf made it clear in his questions, that ASSAf is mandated to provide evidence-based science advice. And that's important to bear in mind when you consider MAST. We are talking one academy with another academy. MAST is a very different animal. It's not a body which has governed by an act. In its guidelines, there's nowhere mentioned that it's mandated to provide advice to government. It doesn't receive any funding from government. It relies entirely on funding from its own members and then from little grants that we receive now and then. For example, this NASA grant that we receive for doing this organization. So funding didn't come up as an important issue, but it is an important issue. It is an important issue for MAST. We cannot plan for 3 years as ASSAf does. We have to live year by year, depending on the funds that we have, that we collect, and the grants that we manage to get, and formulate little grants here and there. And I think that can be a major constraint as far as the operation of for science advice. We have to accept, and it was said, that we live in an ecosystem of science advice. Academies are one of them, but there are others as well. And this applies to Mauritius as well. There are advisors within government, science advisors. There are statutory bodies as well. We have the Mauritius Research and Innovation Council, which exists as a corporate body and which advises on scientific and technology matters. So we have to be able to learn how to coexist in this ecosystem. And what is also important, which we do not always do very well, is to build a synergy among all these partners within that ecosystem. I don't know whether ASSAf does it very well in South Africa. We certainly do not do it that well. We heard there are many challenges in providing science advice, and I thought that was extremely interesting. The first one was the question of relevance, that we need to determine the needs of policymakers. Now that's interesting. we have to find out, first of all, whether policymakers require certain advice or not. And we have to play this against what we think is important and convince policymakers that there is a need for looking at a particular issue which is important. The second challenge is timeliness. I was very interested to hear that the studies undertaken by ASSAf can take anything between 18 months to 3 years, 36 months. That's quite a long period. And if you're providing advice in a particular area, it can, the timeliness of it and making sure that it's provided in time, and the consultation that should go on all the time during that preparation of that advice, I think is extremely important. And receptivity, I think that's a very important concept and very important word. And the two examples given in South Africa, I thought was amazing. Quite interesting, not amazing, but quite eye-opening. The first one was on this whole issue of HIV/AIDS, where clearly there was scientific evidence which was not accepted nationally. And the second one, where several academies got together and provided advice on sexual orientation in Africa. So you were going beyond South Africa here, and yet this was not accepted, and still apparently is not accepted in many countries. So receptivity, whatever be the quality of that scientific advice, I think receptivity is important, and we have to learn to live with that situation. We heard that also that science advice is not always taken for many reasons. The two cases I've mentioned, there are very clear reasons there, but they can be political, but there can also be financial constraints. Government may wish to do something, but it doesn't have the funds. And there could also be public opinion, as in the case perhaps of the issue of sexual orientation, where the public clearly reject the scientific advice given. The whole issue of advice versus advocacy, I thought was very interesting. It's a complex issue, and it's one that I think we were told, beware about advocacy. We should always concentrate on science advice. But I think at MAST level, we need to sit down and unpack this difference between advice and advocacy. The presentation on inclusion in science advice, I thought was extremely interesting. That we have to take gender into account, we have to take age into account, diversity and all that. But inclusiveness also must take into account local knowledge, in particular in the case of Africa, traditional knowledge, which is so important for Africa. I think we have to bear in mind all these issues. We have to take all these into account in formulating science advice. To me, today has been really extremely important for MAST. We have to learn from this. We have to accept the fact that we are different from ASSAf. We have certain constraints, financial constraint, the way we are structured, that constraint as well. But that should not prevent us from making advice and providing advice. Interestingly, it was mentioned that ASSAf participated in a ministerial advisory committee on COVID-19. We at MAST, without any prompting from government, we ourselves produced a simple couple of page advice on COVID-19 when that was taking place. And we did this because we have among our members, among council members, somebody who is very well known, a scientist who has worked in this area and who could, together with, he has close ties with the government and the Ministry of Health, and internationally as well. He has worked internationally. And we provided some very interesting advice on COVID-19. And it had to be very quick because, by the time, if we had waited for 2 or 3 years, that advice would not have been very useful. I don't know whether that advice was taken by our government or not. I hope it was, but certainly that was a useful exercise. And that's a way where it shows how we can contribute to policy making. I think I'll stop here. As I said, I'm sure I haven't captured every one of the very, very, very important points made during this presentation, but I hope I've captured a few things, and I hope we, MAST members who are present and participating today, have learned from this, and we really sincerely hope that we continue this collaboration, regional collaboration of academies to learn from each other and to carry on the important work that science advice can make. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Ghulam, for this crisp and very nice summary encompassing all the different presentations, but also linking MAST, how it could benefit from this webinar and from the discussion. So I think it's the initial point, and there's a lot of there's a long road ahead for us to explore. With those words, I would like to invite Dr. Jean-Claude Detré, GCSK, sorry, and a former MAST president, for concluding remarks and a vote of thanks. So over to you, Jean-Claude.
Thank you, Salem. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm delighted to see so many participants at this virtual meeting. As past president and fellow of the Mauritius Academy of Science and Technology, it is a privilege for me to deliver the vote of thanks for today's, I would say, enlightening webinar, which has for main objective to strengthen science advice capability of MAST. This is new territory for us, and I think we will probably, when we will look back over this event, we will realize how much it has been improved. Anyway, we have just heard from Professor Mohamed Bai key takeaways. I'm confident that all of us, especially MAST members, have gained valuable insights on science advice. These lessons will guide us in our forthcoming activities, including a hybrid workshop on Wednesday, 19 June 2024, and a dissemination workshop of a policy brief on food security scheduled 1 month later on 23rd July 2024. I encourage you all not to miss these two events, and you will receive further details soon. On behalf of MAST, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to all our partners in today's endeavor. First of all, NASAC AIP for funding this project. Our collaborators in the project, first ASSAf, the Academy of Science of South Africa, for its support throughout the preparation of this event and for hosting the webinar. A special thanks go to Dr. Kolani Umbiza for his invaluable support and commitment. Secondly, the Global Young Academy of Science Advice Working Group. Thirdly, SAYAS, the South African Young Academy of Science. Fourthly, MYAI, the Mauritius Young Academy Initiative. We also extend our gratitude to all our speakers who contributed in making this webinar a real success. From ASSAC, Dr. Susan Welsman and Dr. Melusi Ntwala. From GYA Science Advice Working Group, Dr. Justine Umwendi. I'm sorry for the pronunciations. Our thanks also go to all MAST Council members. And of course, a special thanks goes today to Dr. Salem Samdani, our president, for his endless effort dedicated to this project, and also to members of the project committee of MAST, including Dr. François Driver, Dr. Ravi Bola, and Dr. Asha Samdani. They have also, with their dedication and commitment, a great start today. Last but not least, many thanks to all participants for their active involvement. Before closing, I invite you all for our next event, a hybrid workshop of science advice on food security, scheduled, as I mentioned earlier, for 19 June 2024. Until then, I wish you all the best and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Detré. Thank you very much to all participants. to the presenters, and we look forward to see you again next month. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.